We had our men's gathering yesterday, and so that was a ton of fun. And I don't know how Joey did it, but he got steaks that were massive, and I'm pretty sure that there was one cow that had to die per steak that we had. But it was delicious, and so thanks for everybody for coming out, and it was a good time. So today we are going to continue in our series, our study through the book of Jonah, and so we're going to pick up in Jonah 1, verse 4 is where we're going to start off today. We'll get to that in a minute. But Jonah is an interesting book. Jonah, everybody, all the characters you meet are reversed, and we're going to get to actually see some of that today. But Jonah, where all the other prophets are so much focused in on the message that God's bringing, the prophet Jonah in the book of Jonah is all about the story. And so the goal of Jonah is for it to hold up a mirror to each of us and to say, are you following God, and where are you falling short, and where are you not loving those around you like you should, or where is the hardness of your heart? And so today's going to start that journey for us where we're really able to hold up that mirror. And for me, as I've looked through the book and studied through it and listened to different pastors through my lifetime just talk about it, one of the things that's it's always interesting is as God hurls the storm at Jonah, which is what we're going to get into, and it got me thinking that there's a lot of times in my own life where I don't always see God's hand. It's not one of my strong suits. God can do really small things, that just little small blessings in my life, or He can do really big things. And my temptation and what I really normally go towards is that I think it's just more coincidence. Or maybe I worked really hard to make that happen, and I don't always see what God is doing. And so I've had to take a lot of time throughout my life to be really intentional to see where God is moving and where God is working. And so that's one of the things that it's going to hold up is, are you looking for where God's working and what God's doing in your own life? And it got me thinking, Lena loves to play, any number of things. Right now she's into babies, and so she's got to be a little mama everywhere she goes, and she has like a million little baby dolls. But right before this, we got her a big doll house. And so one of the things that she loved doing was getting her doll house together, and she'd play family, and I would sit down and play with her from time to time. And so one of the times that I sat down to play with her, she would just have the randomest stuff in the house, and it didn't make sense why I was in there. And so as we sit down, and of course she gives me the little grandpa dad doll that I've got to play with, and she's got like a box of Band-Aids in there. And so I'm trying to figure out why this box of Band-Aids are in there. And then she's got like this big old teacup that's in there. She's got a stuffed animal that takes up a whole room. And so I'm trying to clear this stuff out so that we can play. And she tells me no. She like pulls my hand away and she says, "No, Dad." And then she goes through and she points at each of these. She's like, the Band-Aid box is this, that, the stuffed animals is this, and the teacup is this. And so for me, when I'm looking at the dollhouse, it all looked random. Like why is a box of Band-Aids in there? Why is this in there? We need to clear this out so that we can play. But for Lena, everything in the dollhouse served a purpose. And as we played, all of those things got used, even though they were completely random, didn't make sense. In her imagination, they served a really good purpose. And so I share that because in our life, there's going to be things that we see as random that don't make sense. And if we have the faith to really trust that God loves and cares for each of us enough, that He cares for you, that there's not really going to be anything random that ever just comes into your life. Nothing too small or too big where God's not bringing different things into your life. And that's what happens with the book of Jonah. In this story, it's a really big thing. But let's look through the story again and just remind ourselves. Last week, we talked about Jonah and we introduced the story. Jonah is a prophet of God, and we know that in 1 Kings, Jonah is kind of a questionable prophet at that. You don't really know, is he really leaning into the Lord and has a great relationship with Him, or is he just kind of doing this as a job? And so when we meet Jonah, God comes to him, He says, I want you to preach to the Ninevites. And the Ninevites are those that live in the city of Nineveh, and that's the capital city of Assyria, Israel's enemy. And so Jonah hates the Ninevites. He hates the Assyrians. He doesn't want any part of that. He hates them so much that when he tells God no, he doesn't just sit there and not do anything. Jonah actually gets up and goes in the opposite direction that God asked him to. He hates those people so much that he's not willing just to stand there and not do anything. He wants to show God that I'm not even willing to go, so I'm going to move as far away as possible. That's his goal. And so as we pick up in the story where he is running from God and what God's mission and purpose is, this is where we pick up in Jonah 1, 4 to 6. Jonah 1, 4 to 6 is where we're going to pick up our story. While you're turning there, one of the things that I love about this book, and one of the things that's going to constantly, we're going to talk about it today, is that Jonah runs from the Lord. And what we see God do is we don't see God just pick up a new prophet and send him to the Ninevites. He actually throws this storm at Jonah, not as his judgment, not as him being mad. God's not mad at Jonah. This is where the book of Jonah, God's really trying to reach Jonah the whole time. And he's trying to reach him through sending him to the Ninevites. And so that each of us, we might have a mission and a purpose in what we're doing, but it doesn't mean that we're just this tool that God uses, and then once we're done, he abandons and throws us out. Actually, God has a great purpose, and his goal is to try to build a relationship with us and help us grow as we are on mission. And so you're not just some tool that can be discarded, but you're something where God's going to pursue you each and every step of the way. So let's go in. Jonah 1, 4 to 6. It says, Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish. And so Jonah hears the word of the Lord, decides, I'm not going to the Ninevites. I can't stand them. I actually hate those people. I'm going to go the opposite direction. And so he boards this boat to Tarshish. And while they're on the sea, God hurls, that's the correct verb there, he throws the storm at Jonah. And the storm gets so bad that these experienced sailors start to freak out. Now, if you're a sailor in that time and you have cargo, that's your livelihood, that's your money. So if a storm is so bad that you're throwing out your money, that's a pretty big deal. And so the storm's so bad, the storm's threatening to break the ship apart. They've now thrown out all of their cargo. They've lost money. And now their only option is to sit there and for each man to pray to his God and hope that that God will answer. It's so bad that the sailors are praying, the captain's praying, but now the captain's going to each of the people that are on the ship and making sure that they're praying. So when he finds Jonah, he wakes Jonah up, not to just tell him about the storm, but saying, hey, if you don't start praying to your God, then this ship's going to fall apart and we're all going to die. And what's really interesting is that as we're reading through the story, Jonah says nothing. So there's this big storm that's threatening everybody, and Jonah's response is nothing. Jonah doesn't care. Jonah, as we continue to read the story, knows that God's turned the storm at him, and his response is, I still hate the Ninevites so much. My heart's so hardened to what you want me to do. I'm refusing to play game with what you're trying to do. I don't want to play any part of what God's trying to do. And so he refuses to do anything. And so as we go through our life, there's going to be moments where God brings in situations. He's going to bring in storms. They could be big, they could be small. He's going to bring people into your life. And the first thing that the book of Jonah really holds up to you is, are you noticing and seeing where God's moving? Now, the second part of that question is, how do you respond? That's the most important part of that, is how are you going to choose to respond when God moves? And we see with Jonah that he doesn't care. That his first response to the storm is not even fear. He is so apathetic and so not caring, so against the Ninevites, he doesn't care that the ship's going to fall apart. He doesn't care that everybody could possibly die. But the sailors are recognizing and realizing that this storm is getting ready to destroy everything that they own. And so as we go through life and as we turn our hearts away from God, there's consequences that are to be had for that. And most of the time that means that we harm those that are around us. Jonah hops on a ship to run away from God, and he ends up harming the sailors and the captain. They have to throw off all of their money, all of their cargo, and their ship is threatening to break apart, which means at the very best, they're going to have major repairs when they get back to port. Jonah's disobedience, Jonah's not caring for what God has for him, harms those around him. And so we've got to be careful when God's calling us to do things that we don't always want to do, things that we're not excited about, that at the end of the day, we can also harm those around us. What's really amazing is that Jonah didn't set out to hurt these people. But Jonah's hardness of his own heart, where he's not praying and talking to God, and Jonah could very well stop the storm. He knows why the storm's been sent. All he has to do is to turn back. But Jonah doesn't care. Jonah's own hardness of heart, Jonah's own unwillingness to listen to the Lord, to talk to the Lord, to pray to the Lord, is harming those around him. And so it comes back in the question of our own hearts, that when we run away from God, it damages and impacts our own hearts in such a way that it hurts those around us. And for me, one of the things that I get challenged with as I read through this book and I see where God is constantly directing and trying to really pull Jonah back to him. Is I had a friend that is a real close friend of mine, and every time I talk to him, he's always talking about what the Lord's doing in his life. He has the smallest little things to the biggest things. I mean, he goes from like gospel conversations and talking about Jesus and church to his friends to the smallest little things that happen in his life and getting like a free coffee one day or anything like that. And he just sees the Lord's hand in his life time and time and time again. And every time he talks to me, it's convicting. And not in this bad way where I feel bad talking to him, but in talking to him, it's that I get to see how God's light shines through him and he sees God in everything. And as I've already shared, that's not one of my strengths. It's not one of the things that I do naturally. And so it convicts me, and the Lord always uses that to say, okay, where am I moving in your own life? And how are you responding? And so it's important for us to realize that God's moving and working in our own life. God hurls this storm at Jonah, not as a judgment, not because God's mad at him or frustrated at Jonah, as we see in Jonah 4, which we'll get to a long time from now. But in Jonah 4, God has conversation with Jonah 2 separate times. And his whole goal is to try to change Jonah's heart on how he sees these people. And so God wouldn't be having those conversations with Jonah if he didn't want to try to change and draw Jonah back to him. So this storm is not some kind of judgment, not God being mad and throwing lightning at Jonah. It is that the Lord is having to bring such a big storm into Jonah's life because Jonah's heart is that hard. Jonah's walked away in such a big way that the only way to draw him up and to wake Jonah up is to throw a storm of this magnitude. And if we're looking at the story as it unfolds, Jonah says nothing. So even though there's this massive storm that's coming towards Jonah, Jonah's response is nothing. And so when we go through situations and the Lord's working in our life and we might feel like everything's falling down apart aside from us, it might be that the Lord's trying to wake us up, and the only way that we will wake up, the only way that we will kind of draw ourselves out of sleep is that we needed something that big to draw us back to it. But the important part is you've also got to realize how you respond to that. So let's keep going. Jonah 1, 7-12. Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots on how to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lots fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? And from what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Verse 10, this terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" For they knew that he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, and so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" Verse 12, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon us." So finally, Jonah says his first words in the whole book, and it is pretty apathetic still. Jonah doesn't care. So if you're looking at this story, the captain comes in and the storm hits the boat. The boat is falling apart. Captain has to come and wake Jonah up. Jonah, he says, "Please pray." Jonah doesn't respond or say anything. And then the men are trying to figure out, okay, what can we do? What's our last line of thing? And so now who can we blame for why this is happening to us. And so they start to cast lots, which is a way of just kind of like rolling dice and figuring out which person it was. So Jonah the whole time knows that this storm is happening because of him. He allows them to cast lots. He knows that it's going to land on him, and yet Jonah's response is, I don't care. He doesn't move. He doesn't lean in. He doesn't try to respond. He doesn't step up and say, hey, I'm the reason this storm is happening. He allows all of it to play out. And then look at what he says. Verse 12, pick me up and throw me into the sea. So they need to know what to do. And what Jonah's response is not, hey, I'll throw myself into the sea. I'll handle this, or I'll pray and I'll talk to God. His response is, you can pick me up and throw me into the sea. So where's all the responsibility at that point? Jonah's taken all of this responsibility and shoved it aside because he doesn't care. Jonah knows the Lord's working. He sees God's hand in all of this, and yet he refuses each and every step of the way to play game, to respond to what God's doing. And so at this point, he puts the responsibility on them. If you want to fix this problem, you're going to have to pick me up and throw me into the sea. And the sailors don't like that response. They try to, we'll get into it in a minute, and they'll try to save him, but they can't. And so we know this story pretty well, because what happens after Jonah's thrown into the sea? Swallowed by a fish. That's right. He's swallowed by a fish. And so because we know this story so much, we just kind of assume that Jonah knows that when he gets thrown into the sea, that a fish is going to come up and eat him. He doesn't know that. In this whole story, there is no faith in the Lord. There is no, I'm going to turn back to the Lord. There is apathy and not caring every step of the way. And so when Jonah hears this and he tells him to throw him into the sea, this is not like, hey, get me out of here and the fish will swallow me and I'll go back to Nineveh. This is, I would rather die than go preach to the Ninevites. Throw me into this sea, the storm that's destroying this boat, because you know if you get thrown into that sea, you're going to die. Jonah's response is not one of faith. Jonah's response is, I don't care. I would rather die than be sent to the Ninevites. That is how much this man hates the Assyrians and does not want to see the Lord's grace and mercy go towards them. And this is his response. Not taking responsibility for any of it, but placing that on those around him. You can throw me into the sea. No praying. No, let me talk to the Lord. No, hey, I'll throw myself into the sea. Every part of this, Jonah's hands are up and he doesn't care. And so as we go through storms, not even storms, as God just works in your life, or this mirror of the book of Jonah starts to hold itself up. This is, are you seeing where God's moving in your life, and then how are you responding to that? Are you responding in faith and trust? Or has God asked you to do something, and God's wanting you to do something, or maybe He's placed people in your life time and time again, and you can't stand them, but maybe the Lord's trying to get you to talk to them, trying to get you to build a relationship with them. How we respond to that matters. It's not just enough for us to see the Lord working. It is all equally important within that is how we respond. And are you willing to trust the Lord even when you don't want to? And Jonah wasn't willing to trust God. Jonah's hatred for someone else blinded him and hardened his heart to the point where he refused every step of the way, to the point where it threatens the lives of those around him. And Jonah doesn't care. So let's keep going. Jonah 1, 13 to 16. Instead, so Jonah tells them, throw him into the sea. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Now the storm is worse. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So the response this whole time, as we're reading through the book of Jonah, all of the characters are reversed. If I was to sit here and tell you this story, not assign names and tell you who was close to the Lord or not, and I was to say that there's this big storm that came and somebody responded really well and trusted the Lord, and another person had their hands up, did not care what happened, you would probably say the prophet of God is the one that trusted the Lord the whole time, right? You would say that if we're looking at the responses, the sailors are a much more godly response. Towards the end, they actually come to know the Lord and they make sacrifices to him. Jonah gets thrown into the sea and still refuses to do anything. And so the whole book is this reverse on our expectations. It is the people that do not know God that respond favorably to him every step of the way. And it is Jonah, who is supposed to know God and have this relationship with him, that does not respond at all. And at many points refuses to respond. And so I share this because I think there's a lot of times in my own life that I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, and I assume that I'm good. I assume that I'm more godly, I have a closer relationship with God, that I may not need to do other things. And the book of Jonah reminds me, and it should remind you, that that's not the case. That just because you follow God, you got to make sure that you continue to follow him each and every day. And that when the Lord asks you to do something that you don't want to do, you don't think is possible, you might hate the people around you. Jonah, that's the reason why he doesn't do any of this. How we respond to that matters. When the Lord's hand comes in and he throws a storm in your life or he brings you blessing, seeing that hand matters because that's what allows you to respond. But in how you respond matters. The sailors looked at all of that happened and knew that out of all the gods they served, that this was the Lord. This was really the real God. They respond by making vows and offerings to him. Jonah responds, "Throw me into the water, let me die." That's Jonah's response. But the Lord's not done with Jonah. We'll get to that next week. You know that a big fish swallows him, and then there's going to be a prayer in there. But Jonah's heart doesn't really change necessarily because of that prayer. One of the things is I want you to think about and wrestle with this week is, where are you seeing God's hand in your life? Where is God working? And how are you responding to that? And if you are like the sailors and you're seeing God's hand respond and you are responding with humility and offering worship to the Lord and blessing him, that's great. But if you're on that other side where you're seeing God's hand work, maybe you're struggling to see his hand, you are much more like Jonah, where your hands are up and you refuse to take the next step. My encouragement for you is to reach out to the Lord now. The Lord is going to continue to try to pursue you and bring things into your life to try to jar you and wake you up. Because your spiritual life, your relationship with him is the most important thing. Not the money, not your power, not anything that we have in this life. The only thing that matters, which matters the most, is our relationship with him. And God's going to pursue that as best as he can. But he still needs you to respond as well. How are you going to respond to that? The glimmer of hope and the silver lining is that God redeems Jonah's disobedience. He asks Jonah to go and preach to the Ninevites. Jonah refuses to. Jonah gets on a ship. The ship almost gets destroyed and taken apart. And yet, through it all, God's grace and his love reaches out and changes the lives of those sailors and that captain, where they make vows to the Lord and they make sacrifices and they change from worshiping these idols to changing to worship the Lord. God redeems that whole situation. But what's even crazier is Jonah gives them no reason to. This is all like an in spite of part of this. Jonah doesn't reach out to them and care for them. Jonah doesn't pray for them. Jonah doesn't offer up prayers for the ship. Jonah's silent. And then he places the responsibility on them. You can pick me up and throw me overboard. I'm not jumping off, though. At every point of the way, Jonah doesn't give them a reason to follow God. And yet God, in the silver lining of what he's trying to do in Jonah's life, is also going to use this whole thing to reach sailors and a captain and bring them to come to know him, have a relationship with him. So I share that with you because maybe you have had big storms in your life, or maybe you look back and you say, man, I know the Lord asked me to do this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 40 years ago. I know the Lord asked me to do this 1 month ago. And I look back and I wish I had stepped in that direction. When the Lord asked me to go right, I wish I had gone right, but I didn't. I made a left turn. I went this way with my life instead of going that way. And there's this silver lining of hope where God redeems us in our situations, even when we place ourselves in the middle of our suffering and our struggles. And so just because you disobey at one moment doesn't mean that God's abandoned you. It doesn't mean that he can't redeem your situation. That he can actually still serve a great purpose in where you are. And so I want to leave you with that this week. There's a lot to unpack, but Jonah, remember, holds up this mirror to you. For some of you, it might be trying to figure out where the Lord's hand is. For others of you, that mirror might be responding correctly to what the Lord's trying to do in your life. And others of you, if you've heard this and you're thinking back through your own life, you look back with regrets. You wish you had gone this way when you went that way. But in this story where Jonah disobeys God and hardens his heart every step of the way, God still uses that and redeems it and makes something beautiful come from it. And so just because you might have that regret doesn't mean that life's over, doesn't mean that God can't redeem it. So let me pray for you, and then we'll have our time of response. So if you want to come up and pray and just, if there's anything on your heart, I'd love to be able to pray with you. Or if you would like to join the church, be baptized, anything, you can come forward now. Let me pray. God, we come to you, and Lord, we're just, thank you so much for the story of Jonah. Jonah gets it wrong time and time again from what we can see. And yet, Lord, you love him and you've pursued him. And you didn't throw him off. You didn't start with somebody else. But God, you pursued him. And Lord, when he made the wrong decision, you still redeemed it. And those men came to know you. And so, Lord, we celebrate and we worship you because you can turn the worst decisions into some of the best things that happen. So, God, I pray for our church. I pray for everyone here that we would see your hand in our life and we would trust that it's you. From the smallest little blessings to the biggest things in our life. And Lord, help us to respond to those like we should. And God, we also pray that you would redeem us and redeem our situations when we make the wrong decision. We ask these things in your name. Amen.